Good afternoon and a very, very warm welcome this afternoon to the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, a webinar cum seminar series. We have the pleasure of having with us today Dr. Meenakshi Jain, who is going to speak on the making of India, some early manifestations. Uh, Dr. Meenakshi Jain is currently a senior fellow here at Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. She has occupied many academic positions in the past. She was a senior fellow at ICSSR. Uh, she was a member of the academic council of, she is a member of the academic council of Nalanda University. She was member of the governing council of Indian Council of Historical Research and formerly associate professor of history at Gargi College, University of Delhi. She has many significant publications, well acclaimed publications to her credit. Um, Her latest book, which she recently presented to me, and unfortunately, because of so many other things, I haven't been able to read so far, but I have been promising to Meenakshi ji that soon I will read and discuss. This is Vasudev Krishna and Mathura, published in 2021. And then, of course, another very well acclaimed book, Flight of Deities and Rebirth of Temples. These are just two of her significant books. I believe that in today's lecture, she is going to talk about how the identity of India, as distinct from a modern nation state, of course, evolved over thousands of years on the basis of an analysis of various texts, traditions, etc., etc. She is going to do that. Now, I believe, and we were just discussing this, that one reason, of course, that this identity of India in its long past is, it's kind of not given the due credit that it deserves, is partly, of course, because of the British colonial discourse, which focused on how India had always been disunited, how it was they who united India politically for the first time. So some of it is, of course, because of that, and the other is because the idea of India then gets mixed up with India as a modern nation state. And third, of course, it is because of the larger problem, of course, of various kinds of sources which have not been properly analyzed in the last 40, 50 years. I believe that what Dr. Meenakshi Jain is going to talk about today is, it is in the same league as, or is in the same line, and I think she has gone through that work, the great work of the French historian Fernand Braudel, L'identité de la France, that is the identity of France. It's a voluminous and very, very significant work. And there he argues how France as a modern idea, of course, is one thing, as a modern nation state, but France evolved over hundreds or even maybe thousands of years. And on the basis of its geography, its culture, its languages, how it was politically organized, he draws that identity of France. I believe that Dr. Meenakshi Jain is attempting something of that sort probably in today's lecture. So with these very few words, I would now once again welcome Dr. Meenakshi Jain and all other members of the audience here and invite her to proceed with her lecture.
Thank you, Dr. Mishra, and thank you, NMML, for inviting me to deliver this talk, and thank you all for coming. Of course, my work is not at all as ambitious as you. Okay. My work is not at all ambitious and of the scale as Braudel's. It's a tentative beginning, but I think it's important to bring these facts to the table because these facts, they have been sidelined in the academic discourse of the last half century at least. The dominant school of Indian historiography has actually relied mainly on imported concepts and models that are not always applicable to this country. I'm, of course, by no means advocating that the discipline of history should remain aloof from new concepts and theoretical formulations. opening fresh vistas for research is vital to ensure that the discipline retains its vitality and continues to grow. But it is ironical that in independent India, the dominant school of historiography has not only depended on imported models, but ironically, in many fields, has continued to parrot the British colonial administrative scholars' narrative of India's past. The classical expression of the view that India owed its unity and physical unity to the British was by the imperial historian John Strachey. Confronted with the vastness and diversity of the country, he declared, in quotes, "There is not and never was an India, or even any country of India possessing, according to European ideas, any sort of unity, physical, political, social, or religious. No Indian nation, no people of India of which we hear so much." By contrast to the dominant historical narrative of independent India, Indian scholarship of the late 19th and early 20th century, which was articulated at a time when British imperialism was at its peak, presented a sustained, systematic, and detailed counter to the colonial view of India. Now, besides political unification, what we today call Hinduism was also declared to be a British contribution to India. As recently as 1995, a professor at a leading university denied any concept of Hindu religious unity before the 19th century. According to him, this concept was mistakenly built up by the British, and later this was necessary to build up an Indian national identity. This is in quotes. This indeed is a case where nationalist politics in a democratic setting succeeded in propagating Hindu religious unity in order to obtain an impressive statistical majority when compared with other religions. It is a manipulated majority which would certainly appear much less dominating if the two largest religious communities in present-day India, the Vaishnavas and the Shaivas, were recognized as having distinctly separate, though culturally religious origins. In other words, the political entity known as India and the spiritual religious traditions known as Hinduism were both regarded as British constructs of the 19th and early 20th century. Given the nature of the subject, my account will be largely empirical. I will present some facts that were operative in India from early on, which seem to have receded into the background in the colonial Marxist narrative. I have restricted my citations and illustrations to before the Common Era, which present some of the earliest articulations on the subject and well before the advent of modern historians of all hues. I divide my talk into 4 broad sections. In the first section, I will briefly discuss the stages by which knowledge of the subcontinental landmass was acquired. In the second section, I highlight some early expressions of sentiments towards this land. In the third section, I draw attention to literary evidence of the need for one political entity over the whole subcontinent, and also expressions of cultural unison. And in the fourth section, I will briefly discuss some early manifestations of cultural harmony. So my first section is mapping the landscape. It is nobody's case that India was a given at the start of her civilizational journey. Indeed, knowledge of the subcontinental landmass was acquired in stages. That process was more or less complete by the 5th century BCE. Remarkably, this is a process that can be gleaned through ancient texts. The earliest expression of awareness of parts of the subcontinent was the oft-quoted Nadi Stuti of the Rig Veda. From that Stuti, it was clear that the composers were familiar with the land of the 7 seas, that is, northwest India and Punjab. In that hymn, the rivers to which the land owed so much were deified by a grateful imagination and received worship and homage. Subsequently, large parts of India became known, as can be seen in the writings of Patanjali, the Dharma Sutras of Bodhayana and Vasishtha, and the complete definition of the landmass as a holy land. The complete definition of North India as a landmark, as a holy land, was in the Manusmriti. It defined this land as Aryavat, and it included Kurukshetra, Panchal, Sword Sena, present-day Haryana, Western Punjab, Braj, etc. So from the Himalayas to Narmada, and from the Western Sea to the Eastern Sea, we get a complete description of India in the Manusmriti. The movement eastward was first indicated in the Shatpad Brahmana. It narrated the story of Videhi Madhava and his priest who crossed the Gandak that came down from the Himalayas. They settled east of that river, where the country was cultivated and civilized, unlike in former times. The movement southwards commenced around 1000 BC, and it's supposed to have reached its completion by the time of Katyayana, that is the 4th century BCE. The movement southwards possibly served as the historical basis for the legends of the sage Agastya in the epics, Purans, and Tamil literature. The Mahabharata presented his story in detail, as also his marriage to Lopamudra, a princess of Vidarbha, Badami. That story marked the commencement of Agastya association with the south. Tamil tradition viewed Agastya as a Tamil Muni, a Tamilian sage and author of the first Tamil grammar and royal chaplain of the divine line of Pandya kings. Those were legends, but they could not be regarded as having no historical basis. The Vindhya mountain range that separated northern and southern India appeared to have been first crossed in the time of the Brahmanas. The Aitharya Brahmana, which is dated to the first half of the 1st millennium BCE, referred to a king Bhima of Vidarbha. That indicated movement of people from the north and their settlement in Vidarbha just below the Vindhyas. Jain cave inscriptions in the Tamil Brahmi script attested to the presence of Jain monks in the region around Madurai. Radiocarbon dates from the archaeological contexts containing Tamil Brahmi and Brahmi inscriptions on pottery revealed that those scripts existed in South India and Sri Lanka as early as the 5th century BCE. Jains began traveling to the Tamil region from northern India using trade routes along the eastern coast in the 4th century BCE, just 1 or 2 centuries after the rise of Jainism in North India. Well before that, the sutras of the Sanskrit grammarian Panini, who lived around the 6th century BCE, attested to his considerable knowledge of the ancient geography of India. Panini undertook what has been described as the original survey of place names from the Pami region and Afghanistan to Kalinga and the Assam Valley. The westernmost area that he mentioned was Farghana, He was aware of the divisions of eastern India. On the west side, he referred to Kutch as well as islands adjoining the sea. He mentioned Sindh, and the southernmost limit of his knowledge was Asmaka, that is modern Pathan on the Godavari River. Katyayana, who lived in the 4th, 3rd century BCE and wrote Vartikas to supplement Panini, he mentions the Chola, Chera, and Kerala king regions of South India that were known to him but were not known to Panini. Now, the physical layout. Several early texts actually describe the physical layout of the land. The Bhumi Parvan in the Bhishma Parva of the Mahabharata poetically described India from south to north as resembling a bent arrow with a string pulled by hand, forming an apex at Dhanush Kodi. The Mahagovind Sutta, the oldest section of the Buddhist Tripitaka, placed around the 5th century BCE, named the land Mahaprithvi, and it said it is shaped like a bullock cart. It is rectangular in the north and conical in the south. The Jain text Jambudvipa Pannati stated that Bharatvarsha was situated south of the Himalayas and between the eastern and western seas. It appeared from the north like a bedstead and from the south like a bow. It gives the description of the country. It is divided into 6 portions. It has 2 large rivers, the Ganga and the Sindhu, and the Vindhya mountain ranges, which divide the north from the south. We also have the Puranas, which attest to the growing geographical knowledge of India. As per current understanding, by 500 BCE, at the latest, most parts of the subcontinent were known. People felt the need for a comprehensive term for the territory extending from the Himalayas in the north to the sea in the south. In Buddhist literature, the name Jambudvipa was used. Jain and other writers viewed Jambudvip as a continent of much wider extent than the Jambudvip known to the Buddhists. The Jains listed 7 Varshas as constituents of Jambudvip, among them Bharatvarsh lay to the south. Now, after the 5th century BCE, we have Patanjali, who shows awareness of large parts of India, including Kanchipuram and Kerala or Malabar. The Sutta Nipita, among the earliest works of the Buddhist Pali canon, also confirmed growing consciousness of the subcontinent. It mentioned a Brahmin guru, perfect in the 3 Vedas, who was originally at Shravasti, the capital of the Koshal country. He, along with 16 disciples, traversed 600 miles and settled in a village on the Godavari, and there he performed a sacrifice. He sent his pupils to pay homage to the Buddha and confer with him. The Sutta Nipita described the route by which they proceeded northwards. In fact, we have evidence that in the lifetime of the Buddha, the presence of Buddhism is attested to in the Andhra region. And the last point that I want to make in this first section is the Greek information that we have from the Greek sources. The Greeks who accompanied Alexander to India also showed us how much knowledge the Indians had of the shape and size of their country. In 327 BCE, Alexander crossed the Indus and led his troops into the Punjab. He was received by the king at Takshila. In 326, he pressed eastwards towards the Jhelum and confronted King Porus. After that encounter, Alexander moved ahead, crossed the Chenab and then the Ravi. He had heard of the empire of Magad with its capital at Patliputra. he believed that beyond Patliputra was the eastern sea, and it is likely that he planned to go that far. However, before he crossed the Beas and then the Sutlej, he turned back. What prompted him to change his plans? According to some writers, Alexander and his army were badly lost. It has been speculated that Alexander believed the land of 5 rivers to be Upper Egypt, which would eventually lead to the Nile and back to the Mediterranean. However, in Punjab, his men came upon informants who knew otherwise. Alexander's historians chronicle that he caused the whole country to be described by men well acquainted with it. That account has survived in the writings of historians like Strabo and Aryan. According to their narrative, the land described as India was a rhomboid or unequal quadrilateral in shape, with the Indus on the west, the mountains on the north, the seas on the east and south. And the informants actually told him about the actual distance from one place to another. So it was really extraordinary that well before the rise of the Mauryan Empire, the informers could so accurately describe the subcontinental landmass. By the time of Emperor Ashoka, knowledge of the topography of India was a common possession, a content of the popular geographical consciousness. Now, the second is the sentiments towards this land. In this section, I would like to highlight some of the early expressions of sentiments towards this land. This is important. Recently, a leading Marxist historian claimed on a public platform that in the entire body of Sanskrit literature, there was not even one expression of sentiment towards this land. According to him, the first account of praise of this land was in a Persian text by Amir Khosrow in the 13th century. However, the 63 stanza long Prithvi Sukta in the Atharva Ved has been described as the first national song in the world. That remarkable hymn resounded with emotion and gratitude. It presented a picture the like of which is not met with in any other literature of the ancient world. The Prithvi Sukta presented a perfect fusion of love for the land, cultural awareness, and a historical tradition rooted in unity in diversity. In that early phase of national consciousness, the land was named Prithvi after King Prithu, credited with the transition of a wandering people to a life of settled agriculture. Enunciating the ancient philosophy of India, the Prithvi Sukta took note of the diversity of the inhabitants of the land, their varying dialects and behavioral norms, all of whom the motherland nurtured without distinction. Its opening verse recounted the values and ideals that sustained this land, that is, truth, cosmic law, initiation, penance, Veda, and sacrifice. Even earlier, the Nadi Sukta and several other hymns had expressed sentiments of veneration of the land. One other hymn was the Vishwamitra Nadi Sukta. It was a dialogue at the confluence of the Byas and the Sutlej that Vishwamitra wanted to cross. And the seer, the sage Vishwamitra, the way he appeals to the two rivers, it is a remarkable display and of veneration for this land. We have a lot of Bharat Prashastis. Bharat Prashastis or hymns of glory that are found in the epic and Puranic literature. The Bhishma Parva of the Mahabharata contained a song of exaltation of Bharat as the land of mighty sovereigns and heroic people who bestowed immortal distinction on her hoary past. Sanjay addressed the hymn King Dhritarashtra, a descendant of the Bharatas, and he said, "Listen, you of the Bharata race. I am now going to recount to you the history of the glorious land called Bharata. That land which they call Bharata, I shall describe to thee," etc., etc. It is important to note that as geographical consciousness increased, there was a corresponding increase or expansion of the concept of the sacred. The Virat Deh of India, in all its majesty and magnificence, was meditated upon in the preliminary purificatory mantra, "O ye Ganga, Yamuna, Godavari, Saraswati, Narmada, Sindhu, Kaveri, may you come and enter this water of my offering." The Vishnu Puran, which is the date is roughly placed between 400 BCE and 900 CE, that because it went on being revised and rewritten. It described Bharatvarsh as the chosen land. It said, "It is only after many thousand births and the aggregation of much merit that living beings are sometimes born in Bharat." Over 1,000 years later, the great historian Al-Biruni, he perceived and saw this feeling of veneration for the land, and he said, "The Hindus believe there is no country but theirs, no nation like theirs, no king like theirs, no religion like theirs, no science like theirs." So this is what he says 1,000 years later. An important institution that promoted all India perspective and fostered the uniqueness of Indian civilization was Tirths. The Tirth Yatra section of the Mahabharata is a valuable single source of the geography of pilgrimage before the Common Era. It also helps to determine the antiquity of the institution of pilgrimage, which would have started well before the Common Era. It mentioned two pilgrimage routes, the first by the sage Paulastya and the second by the sage Bhaumya. Both accounts suggested a circular clockwise pilgrimage, and it was like a grand pilgrimage of the whole country. Radha Kumud Mukherjee has written a very perceptive account of the importance of pilgrimage. He says, "The institution of pilgrimage is undoubtedly a most powerful instrument for developing the geographical sense in the people, which enables them to think and feel that India is not a mere congeries of geographical fragments, but a single, though immense organism, filled with the tide of one strong life pulsating from end to end." It allowed no parochial provincial sense to grow, which might interfere with the growth of the idea of geographical unity of the mighty motherland. According to him, there was no thought leader or any representative of Indian society who ever said that the pilgrimage should remain confined to the province or the region that he was from. They all wanted pilgrimage to cover as many parts of the Indian subcontinent as possible. Now, the third point is the ideal of one ruler of the subcontinent. The mapping of the landmass was accompanied by a conviction that it should have one ruler. In the colonial period, British administrators claimed that it was the British who unified India. Some scholars in independent India have echoed that line. However, an early articulation by Kautilya in the Arthashastra defined the whole of India as Bharatvarsh, as the area of operation of a Chakravartin Raja. He said, "The area extending from the Himalayas in the north to the sea in the south and 1,000 yojanas wide from east to west is the area of operation of the king emperor. It is the Chakravartin." The Kshatriya Brahmana, placed in the first half of the first millennium BCE, also evoked this ideal when it said, Prithvi, up to the seas, should have one ruler. Subsequently, in the entire body of Sanskrit literature, we have many more such examples, but since I'm giving my examples only from the before Common Era, I'll skip references to the Sanskrit playwright Bhasha and others. Now, cultural congruence. Besides this concept of political unity, we have early expressions of cultural unison as well. Ethinasi, a reputed author of a Dharma Shastra belonging to the Atharva, he said that Dharma stood on 4 legs, that means it was fully developed in the country from Himalayas to Kanyakumari. There are several other instances that I can quote. For example, in the Pali literature, we have recurrent mention of Takshila as a center of learning and how the king of Koshal received his education in Takshila. Jivaka, the famous physician of Bindusar, studied medicine in that city, and a king of Banaras went to Takshila to learn from a teacher. So this constant mapping of the entire subcontinent, culturally, politically, and as centers of learning is what we get from the literature. And Rajshekhar, who wrote the Kavya Mimamsa in the 10th century Common Era, also made an interesting statement that the scholarship of exponents of different systems was celebrated in the city of Patliputra. And just one more thing I want to say about one more important point, that is the development of a script. Another commonality that develops later on is the Brahmi script, which appears in the 3rd century BCE as a fully developed pan-Indian script and was the parent of all modern Indic scripts. After the discovery of extensive written objects of the Indus Valley civilization dating back to the 3rd and 2nd millennium BCE, several scholars suggested that the presumptive indigenous prototype of the Brahmi script would have been the Indus Valley script or some unknown derivative thereof. This argument was first proposed by Langdon in 1931. It was supported by G.R. Hunter in 1934 and later by several authorities like D.C. Sarkar and A.H. Thani. However, till the time decipherment of the Indus script, nothing can be stated with certainty. Moving on, other examples of shared cultural space, ideas, legends. Buddhism, Jainism, and what we now call Hinduism, they presented a picture of cultural accord with the intertwining of their various legends. The Jains regarded Vasudev and Baldev as 2 of their 63 illustrious ancestors. The 24 Tirthankars of the Jains were reminiscent of the 24 forms of Vishnu. Tirthankar Rishabh was regarded by some followers of Vasudev Krishna as an avatar of Vishnu. The Dharma Chakra of Gautam Buddha was very similar to the Vishnu Dharma Chakra. Buddha set the wheel in motion, the sutra that set the wheel of Dharma in motion. Buddha's footprints were paralleled with the reverence for Vishnu's pads. The theory of the avatars of Vishnu was matched by the Buddhist conception of former Buddhas. The fact that a number of Buddhists were absorbed into the Vaishnava fold in the Gupta and post-Gupta periods could perhaps be explained by the assimilation of Buddha as one of the avatars of Vishnu. Shared sacred symbols. Jains, Buddhists, Hindus drew alike on shared storehouse of symbolic and conventional imageries. Sacred pillars, chaityas, thumbs, sacred trees, the 8 auspicious symbols, stupas, chakras, were equally available to Jains, Buddhists, and Hindus as religious symbols or decorative elements. Gods and goddesses like Kuber and Lakshmi showed affiliation to Jainism, Buddhism, and Hinduism. Numerous other auspicious signs like Srivatsa, Kalpavriksha were never the preserve of any one religious group. They sprang from the soil and were the heritage of all with no distinction whatsoever. Ayag pattas or tablets of homage were another shared symbol. These were ornamental slabs bearing the representation of a jinnah or some other object of worship. They were placed in temples. Numerous ayag pattas with their inscriptions have been found at Kankali Tila in Mathura. The use of these highly decorated tablets was, however, not confined to the Jains. German Indologist Führer found a Buddhist specimen among the ruins of a Buddhist vihara at Ramnagar in Bareilly district. The findings of Buddhist ayag pattas indicated their use as part of a broader ritual culture of ancient Mathura, similar to the shared usage of images and stupas. Now, stupas are normally thought to be a feature of Buddhism alone, but at some stage, the Jains also had stupas. Excavations at Kankani Tila attested to a Jain stupa in the first century CE. The Buddhist and Jain stupas were so much alike that later on, King Kanishk is believed to have venerated at a Jain stupa, mistaking it for a Buddhist stupa. So perhaps later on, the Jains realized that the best way to distinguish themselves from Hinduism was to do away with stupa worship. It is commonly assumed that the title of Tirthankar was used only for the 24 Jain enlightened spiritual masters who had gained perfect knowledge. However, the Jain Bhagavati Stuta and the Samana Phala Stuta of the Buddhist Digh Nikay both stated that Mahakali Koshal, a contemporary of Gautam Buddha and Mahavir, claimed the title of Tirthankar. He also called himself Jinnah, Arhant, and Kevalin. So these are now the next important point that I want to make is that all sections of society participated in this spiritual and religious culture. I'll give you the examples. One example from Kankani Tila. It indicated that there were several Jain shrines and temples in the city from perhaps as early as the 2nd century before Common Era. The donors included a layman who donated an arch, a laywoman who donated a temple, a courtesan and her entire household who donated a Jaina figure, and a Jain woman who installed the image of Mahavir in a Jain temple. Several of these ayag pattas were set up exclusively by Jain women. Several donor women seem to have embraced Jainism recently while their husbands continued to be Hindus. And we have examples, other examples of images being donated by the wife of a merchant, the daughter of a goldsmith, the daughter-in-law of an ironmonger, and the daughter of a jeweler. And the most ancient statue of the goddess Saraswati that has been found in Mathura was actually donated by a metal worker. So all these, all sections of society participated in the making of this religious tradition, and it was never the exclusive preserve of one section of society. I just want to give you some examples from Buddhist sites in the Andhra region. We have, the stupas at Bhattiprola, that is 3rd to 1st century BCE, Amravati, again 3rd century, and Jagyapeta, 2nd century BCE. They reveal that besides warriors, merchants, monks, nuns, the donors also included goldsmiths and leather workers. And towards the end of the BCE era, the old practice of making buildings in brick and plaster and wood and bamboo were replaced by creating stone buildings. So in the Buddhist stupas between 100 BCE and 250 CE, we have a lot of Buddhist structures, but none of them is the result of royal patronage, but it is the common people who donated, and those donations are recorded. In the Sanchi Stupa, which was erected by Ashoka in 200 BCE, 250 BCE, the earthen mound was later on encased with stone material, and we have found 631 donative inscriptions at that site. Only 3 of these inscriptions mention royalty. The largest single group of donors, 200 in all, were monks and nuns. The remaining 300 inscriptions recorded donations from ordinary people, from householders, housewives, bankers, merchants, troopers, weavers, writers, and those connected with construction work, artisans, stone masons. And we have donations coming from far off places like Ujjain, Abu, Pushkar, and Patan in Maharashtra. And we also have the interesting case of the ivory workers of Vidisha who donate the gateway that they had carved. A similar story of a very inclusive system is there from Western India. Now, we have a large number of Buddhist caves over here. They're gifted by goldsmiths, jewelers, iron makers, bankers, merchants, physicians, gardeners, fishermen, as also monks and nuns. At Nasik, just 2 of the 23 caves that were carved were by royal donation. The rest were ordinary people. The similar story in Kanheri and the similar story in Junar. All these places, the donors include goldsmiths, a water cistern carrier, merchants, etc. At Karle, we have an interesting case of donations even from Yavans who obviously had become attractive to Buddhism. At Kuda, a small cave complex in South Konkan, we have a female ascetic, a female Sankhya warrior, worshipper, a physician, a gardener among the donors. So the other thing that I want to say is that, in modern scholarship, when we discuss this period, there's a lot of emphasis on Vedic and non-Vedic practices, and with non-Vedic practices not being followed by those who are proponents of the Vedic religion. But Bhula, George Bhula, he excavated the site of Nanaghat, and there he found of the 2nd century BCE an inscription which he regards as the most important inscription of that era in that period. And that inscription talks about a family that is donating this inscription, and they say that we have performed 18 Vedic sacrifices, and now we are offering to Vasudev Krishna and his brother Sankarshan, who are supposed to be non-Vedic deities. So this story is even repeated at Nagri, where the inscription talks about the person having performed the Ashwamedh and is now making an offering for Vasudev Krishna and Sankarshan. The last point that I think I would like to make, 2 points just quickly. Yeah, I'll just finish in 2 minutes. I just want to give 2 examples more. One was from Mathura. Mathura was a great center of Buddhist culture in the early Common Era. But not one Buddhist image discovered so far in Mathura is a royal donation. nor was royalty connected with any of the Jain images found there. So the most famous image that we have from Mathura is the Katra Buddha, a masterpiece, and it is by the mother of a Buddhist monk who creates it for the welfare of the community. So these are the instances that we get from Mathura, that there is no reference to royalty donating. And just two more points. One, and the first point is that when temples begin to be made, there is no site where the temples are exclusively made of one faith, whether it is Jains, Buddhists, or what we call Hindus. They always existed alongside. And for example, at Kankani Tila, which is supposed to be a Jain site, Fruva found the bases of 6 Buddha statues that were inscribed and dated. Last point that I'll make is that there is also evidence of textual uniformity. You know, there is a fundamental unity of sacred texts in the subcontinent. And this was highlighted in a study of the Kural by Professor Nagaswamy. And he pointed out that all the Dharma Shastras were derivative works. They were compiled by sages from Vedic literature, mainly from the Upanishads and other contemporary Shastras. Great works like those of Manu, Yajnavalkya, Gautam, Bodhyan, Parashar, etc. were derivative compilations as professed in the texts themselves. He said the Kural was also a Dharma Shastra compiled in Tamil language for the use of Tamil knowing people. It was the first Dharma text brought to the Tamils by Veluvar. So to sum up and conclude, what I want to highlight or what I wanted to stress was that, we have got used to interpreting and studying our history as a history of lack of unity, of strife, struggle, sectarian wars. And it's just, that there is no big picture ever until we got the big picture with the advent of the British. So the big India is a gift. The united political India is a gift of the British, and so is what we call Hinduism. So this is a view, unfortunately, that has become quite prevalent among certain sections, and they have. The result is that we have got used to viewing our past as a series of conflicts, divisions. There is no big picture. And what I wanted to say was that from the earliest time that we can trace, we do see a big picture emerging in our literature, in our inscriptions, in our texts, and in the acts of people. Thank you for the patient hearing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Meenakshi Jain, for this highly informative lecture on the subject. May I now invite questions and comments from the members of the audience, both those who are present here in the hall and those who have joined online. Please use the mic. Kindly introduce yourself after asking the question.
Myself is Professor S.S. Bakhri, Director, Institute of United Nations and UNESCO Studies. It conducts a diploma course on UN and international understanding. Otherwise, I am a writer also. Well, the most important question is, which Meenakshi Jain has amplified again and again, that it is a time for the country to ascertain about our unity in the past, about our diversity in the past, that the picture which has been projected, according to you, is that India has been a disunited nation. It was never a united nation in the past. Well, from the historical accounts, from your lecture, there is ample evidence, and there are other sources. Our, saints and sages our men and metals, our grammarians and galaxy gazers, our religion and relics, modes and manners are so abundant that the forces of disunity, disruption, um, you can say all the disunities entered this subcontinent only after the close of first millennium, when the aggression started over this country, over this landmass. Otherwise, before that, it is a general observation that it has been a united land in the past. Because of many things, we can count so many things, that it was a united nation in the past. The forces of disunity, disintegration crept into it after the close of first millennium, soon after the aggression started by different invaders.
Any question? Yes, please come up and use the mic.
So thank you, ma'am, for this thought-provoking lecture and for bringing in.
Please introduce yourself.
Okay, I'm Varada. I'm junior fellow at NMML. My question is related to you use the terms geographical consciousness and cultural congruence. So what is the interconnection between these and leading to the political identity of Indians as such, and then in a very modern context, the Indian citizenship? So what would be at the roots of this idea that's cultural, geographical, and political?
You see, what I said was that we did not know of the whole of India when we began our civilizational journey. So the knowledge of this landmass was acquired by stages. But the texts that have survived, they show that as knowledge, more and more knowledge of greater parts of the subcontinent are acquired, correspondingly we have the works of Patanjali. He's the first person to use the word Aryavat. And up till the time of Manu, as we go on acquiring more and more knowledge, they go on extending the concept of sacred to that. And finally, when the whole of India is known, then the Virat Dev, the large heart of India, it begins from the Himalayas till. So that is what I'm saying, that it's a pattern that went simultaneously. It went together. And as Sir said, this was a process that was completed at a particular date. It was more or less completed by a particular date in our history. That is what I wanted to say. And then, as he said, there is a rupture which leads to other complications.
I think can you show me the questions there, Dr. Ramakrishna? Any other question from here in the meantime?
I would like to ask a question too. Can I ask a question? Can I go ahead?
Yes, please go ahead. Dr. Jyoti Rana, please go ahead.
Yes. First of all, thank you, Dr. Meenakshi Jain, for that splendid lecture. Very informative, very perspective building. My question to you is that of the sources that you have spoken of, is there any mention of a formal system of basic education of any kind for the young, for the children?
No, I am not aware of basic education, but I do know that people were going to Takshila for learning.
Mm-hmm.
So people were going to Takshila in this period for learning, which I have mentioned, but basic education, I'm sorry, I cannot answer that.
And I would, coming from this question, I would wonder, was there such an idea as basic education, in the remote past? Because so far as I understand, as a student of modern history, this is more or less a 20th century idea, not even a 19th idea.
May I, this is Nandini Bhattacharya Panda. May I just add, may I?
Yes,
may I
please,
add? In this context, I have a question though, I have some comment, but this basic education was not formalized in the past. I'm sure Meenakshi ji would, throw lights upon it, because that was the Guru Griho education, Guru Shishya Parampara. The gurus were there in a remote village even. The disciples would go, and then even in Mahabharata, like Dronacharya was the Astra Guru. and others were the, for education, for Ved and other Shastras.
Yes,
Um,
ma'am,
this,
you're absolutely right, ma'am. I agree.
yeah, yeah. And secondly, I have some points. Meenakshi ji, it is a fascinating lecture, but I to extend a bit. When you go through Mahabharata or Manusmriti, both texts describe the population, the structure of population. Mahabharata in the context of recruitment of army, and there it is very much specified, those who are beyond the Varnas or beyond little bit of the geographical boundary, they are called Kiratas and Yavanas. And so did Manusmriti elaborated on the population structure. So from the structure of population, one may also get a perception of Bharatabarsha. I don't know whether you would agree or not.
Yes,
All right.
ma'am.
Thank you, Dr.
Yes, ma'am.
Panda. We have another question from Dr. Ramakrishna, who has joined us online.
Yes, am I audible?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes. First of all, I'm Ramakrishnan, and thank you, Dr. Jain, for a very illuminating lecture. I have a somewhat related question, not directly related to the text and so on. So, while we grapple with this idea of India and how united India has been politically, culturally, and so on in historical time, do other countries, like for instance Greece or the United States, also grapple with this idea to this extent? Or what is the status of this problem throughout the world? Because every nation has a finite history.
I'm sorry, I'll not be able to answer this question. I have not studied the other nations. Thank you so much for asking in any case.
Professor Makhanlal.
आपको पूछना जरूरी है? चलिए पूछ.
Somebody.
No, actually,
someone
let
whom
me
I-
clarify. I have been nudging him to ask a question. So.
It's always difficult to ask questions to whom I consider as my younger sister.
Okay.
And she
what?
had all the liberty to say that whether it is necessary for me to ask. So I'm not asking, I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting a couple of things for your kind consideration, and everybody who is hearing also, they must listen carefully. This whole issue of BCE and CE, before Common Era and Common Era, it evolved a couple of decades back under tremendous politics of the Christians and white man.
Yes.
By earlier we were using, I'm having a running battle in the field of history with the dating system. When you use earlier we used BC and AD. BC and AD very clearly meant that we are using Christian era, nothing like Common Era. The moment you say Common Era, does it mean that no other country, no other civilization, no other people have any kind of dating system? And it's not Common Era, it is directly connected with Jesus' life. And therefore my request to you, somebody like you, Meenakshi ji, we must avoid using as far as possible. In none of my writings, be it archaeology, ancient history.
But can you suggest?
Just we should stick to BC and AD, because that really tells there is nothing like Common Era in the whole world.
Yeah. So stick to BC and AD.
Stick to BC and AD, then you indicate in your writing, for the dating you are using Christian era. You are not using, there is nothing. I mean, after all, we have Vikrami Sambat, after all, we have, Shak Sambat, many other things. So my request to you would be to consider that carefully. Secondly, again, wonderfully you quoted Satpat Brahman and the story of Videg Madhav crossing Sadanira to humanize that. And at the same time, lot of, you know better, lot of things have been said about because of this dating. But just to point out that within the same area, Sadanira, Gandak, Gorakhpur, and Balya and all that, now the agriculture goes back to 7000 BC.
1 minute.
7000 BC. Lavra Deva is one of the prime sites today in the world, which is the second most important site in the world beside Mehergarh. Mehergarh is Pakistan. on the Bolan River, Lohra Dewa is in Gorakhpur. Both they gave 7,000 BC dates for earliest agriculture, meaning thereby here we have the agriculture going back to 9,000 years. And that's what I wrote when Lohra Dewa was discovered. And it was published in Felicitation volume of R.S. Sharma Sahab. And when I said that R.S. Sharma dated Satpat Brahman to 7th, 8th century BC, because before that there was no agriculture there. Now the agriculture in the same area has gone to 7,000 BC. तो ऐसा तो नहीं है कि agriculture हम लेके चले जाएंगे सतपथ ब्राह्मण को पीछे छोड़ देंगे.
Where would you
That is where I was coming. That is where I was coming. Then when we talk about the Panini's date, when we talk about Katyayan's date, we talk about Sulb Sutras of Bodhayan, we have to work out the whole new scheme of the things and dump altogether Max Muller.
Can you just suggest somebody
I suggest you, because I have written, I can suggest you personal level. And then the thing somebody asked about education, you were very just a minute, very polite to say that you don't know. No, it's not true. You just wanted to save your time. But beside Dharampal, somebody had already written that there are two fundamental, fantastic books. I'm not referring my own article running 150 pages on Indian education system, but one R.K. Mukherjee's Education System in Ancient India, A.S.L. Taker. These are wonderful books to go through. Very good.
Taker is very meant to, and it's available on the net now.
Oh yeah, it is both of them.
All of us well recognize that India had a long and illustrious tradition of education.
Exactly.
What we were saying was that this basic education, as we regard
there was nothing. You were right. Actually, I forgot to
idea.
mention that Dr. Ravi Mishra was right that whole concept of basic education is very modern one. We always had education. And right from beginning till end. And you know, education began from home.
And education, basically, it was adapted to the requirements of a person. People received the education that they needed for their
It was
life.
not a common education, it was
One which is for the knowledge, other for the earning livelihood. ये ऋग्वेद से ही चालू हो जाता है.
Actually, education meant for employment, I would say, is a strictly modern phenomenon. No, all over the world. Not just in India, but all over the world. Education meant specifically for
otherwise just para and apara vidya.
Dr. Panda, please go ahead.
Yes, I am Rajaram Panda. I am a senior fellow here in Nehru Memorial. I have one question and one small comment by way of also you can take it as a kind of suggestion. When you spoke about the origins of Jainism, Buddhism, so many things, because these are not my area, but as a layman researcher, or a different field, but some familiarity with this area. Did you ever come across in your study the remnants of Buddhist, I think, some relics which are there available in Nagarjuna-konda? So something about that, if you can share some information about that, we will be very happy. And the other comment is a little more serious. Towards the end of your talk, you use the word, you spoke about the disunity, and then the British, they brought all of us together. You use the word gift. This is a gift of the British.
I said they say.
No. You said this is a gift of the British.
She refuted it. Dr. Panda, she refuted it. She didn't say it. Her entire discourse is based on a refutation of the British colonial.
I said they say, we are told that it is a gift of the British, but it is not.
So I think that word should be severely condemned.
Yes.
Because they have come here and have thrown them out.
Yes.
And they are using the word gift. I feel very uncomfortable to even hear that word.
Meenakshi ji has been much more uncomfortable with this word, and that is why whole lecture is on that.
By the way, a very, you said that somebody has said that the entire Sanskrit literature, you cannot find a single prashasti, sentimental expression of praise. No, let us leave the name,
this is last month.
Out of it. But what I'm saying is, how can anybody, who has sort of studied the history of India, can never make a statement like this? There are hundreds of, verses and hundreds of prose writings. All of us know it. Where the land of India has been sacralized, it has been praised, and in fact, it has been called sometimes better than the land, than heaven itself. You say that in Vishnu Puran, you quoted Gayanti Devaha Kil Gita Kani, the Nyastute Bharat Bhumi Vakye. So where gods are saying that blessed are those who are born in the land of India, they are better than ourselves. Everywhere we find so much of it. One point, which I wanted to make was, you quote Al-Biruni, and you say that when Al-Biruni talks about how Hindus are so arrogant, they think that there is no culture like theirs, no religion like theirs, no philosophy like theirs, no land like theirs, no, etc., etc. You see, Al-Biruni has correctly noted our attitude towards ourselves and towards the world. The problem is that in the last 200 years, the way Al-Biruni's Kitabul Hind has been used as a source by historians, that has actually reversed the entire equation. Now, instead of being taken as evidence of our love for our land, culture, religion, it is taken as a hallmark of our backwardness, our rigidity, our degradation, etc. And to which then the Turkish conquest of India, which followed soon after Al-Biruni's stay here, is somehow related. So when you try to explain why India succumbed to the Turkish invasions, this is one of the things. You say, as Al-Biruni said, that we had become a decadent land, so we were arrogant. We were not actually ahead of everyone else in philosophy, religion, culture, and material sciences, but this was our arrogance, and then that arrogance is related to the subsequent conquest of India. So it is a kind of teleological account, I will say, which tries to explain why India was conquered, successfully conquered by the Turks later. But the problem there is that if India was conquered because it was decadent, so much of the world was conquered by the Turks and by other nomadic people after all. Were they also decadent? So this entire argument of decadence hardly explains.
And one more thing, that the amount of time it took for the Arab and Turkish armies to conquer India, it was phenomenal. It took centuries compared to the quick victories they got in Egypt, Syria, Iran, Persia, etc.
If you permit me 1 minute. Prophet Muhammad dies in 632 AD.
100 years later.
And within 100 years, they have overran right up to Greece, Italy, and Spain, whole of Central Asia, Western Africa. But what happens? Just I'm talking about 140 years. But they are held at the border of Afghanistan till 12th century AD, 500 years. No historian wants to talk that the same army which overran the half of the Europe, Central Asia, Egypt and all that, within 100 years, had to wait for 500 years to enter to mainland, except Bin Qasim. Except Bin Qasim, that also he had to go back.
And
in fact,
Professor
this has been widely acknowledged by some of the greatest poets of the last 100 years.
Yeah, but historians.
For example, Hali has written that.
And Professor Makhanlal, the Hindu Shahi dynasty, 4 generations.
Yeah, 4 generations.
4 generations.
Hali says, let me just quote him. ये तीन हिजाजी का बेबाक बेड़ा किया बेसफर जिसने सातों समुंदर निशान जिसका अक्से आलम पे पहुंचा वो डूबा दहाने में गंगा के आकर.
So it is the full poem is this: वो दीने हिजाजी का बेबाक बेड़ा निशान जिसका अक्साए आलम में पहुंचा न अम्माम में ठिठका न कुलजम में झिझका मजाहम हुआ कोई खतरा न जिसका किए पैसफर जिसने सातों समंदर वो डूबा दहाने में गंगा के आकर.
But
just now,
historians don't recognize this kind of thing.
Just let me quote another scholar, philosopher, great writer of the world, Mark Twain. But what he says about,
I think we will continue with this.
Any
other question?
Yes.
Otherwise, we end here.
Yes, I have a specific question.
Ji, please go ahead.
Yeah. So, in all your accounts throughout the lecture, you gave an account of how the awareness develops in the north about the regions in the south. Is there a comparable development in awareness of the southern regions about north, and to see all of this as a unity?
Absolutely. I told you that I quoted Dr. Nagoswami to say that the Quran was a Dharma Shastra text. It was based on northern works. So you just read Vedic Roots of Tamil Literature by Professor Nagaswami. You will get a total thorough account of this Vedic roots of Indian Tamil culture.
Thank you very much. We have run completely out of time. Once again, I take the opportunity to thank all members of the audience and Dr. Meenakshi Jain.
Thank you so much. आप मुझे वो dating का, thank you.